Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, what a crowd we have tonight. Thank you very much for coming. Yeah. I tell you, when you get to be my age, you're just happy to be able to go anywhere, so thanks for coming out for this. I'm Jan Hewley. I'm the president and CEO of the Marines Memorial Association and Foundation. We have two. We're a 501c19 and a 501c3. So thanks for coming. We've been around since 1946, and we're dedicated to commemorating, educating, and serving veterans and active service men of all services and women of all services that have supported us in the past and are still serving. And tonight's presentation is being supported by the generous support of Senior Chief Petty Officer Robert Hansen, United States Navy. Stand up and take a bow and thank him. Thank you, sir, for your generosity and for probably initiating and inspiring this event, not the Pueblo event, but this event tonight to be, even though you're probably old enough to have instigated the other one, but thank you very much for that. So, tonight's going to be a Navy show supported by the Army, okay? We are going to, I said we commemorate, we educate, and we serve. Tonight we're going to commemorate and we're going to educate on part of a very delicate part in our nation's history. I was a Navy ROTC student at Cal Berkeley when the Pueblo was captured. I can remember it. And I can remember what an awkward feeling that was for our nation. But think how awkward it was for the crew and those that were on there. And tonight, you don't want to listen to me, so I'm going to get on with it. But tonight we've got the author of An Act of War, Jack Cheevers, and he's going to do the rest of the introduction and moderate. Now, one of the many good things about Jack is he's a fellow Bear from Cal Berkeley. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jack. Thank you, sir. Take good care of the audience.
Well, thank you, General. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for all turning out tonight. I think we got a pretty good program for you, and I'm going to jump right into it. United States ship Pueblo. The ship was relatively small for a naval vessel. It was only 176 feet long. It was actually an old Army cargo hauler. It had been acquired by the Navy after World War II. It had been making the rounds of the South Pacific, delivering supplies to our troops who were still left in the various islands in the South Pacific when the war ended in 1945. The Navy acquired it and converted it into a state-of-the-art intelligence gathering platform. It was a surveillance ship doing electronic surveillance. And as such, it was packed with all kinds of advanced electronic gear. There were code machines. There were about 10 different code machines used for encrypting and decrypting messages that came to and from the ship. There were all kinds of classified documents on the ship. There were operations manuals for the equipment and the code machines and so forth. All sorts of top secret messages that had been sent to the ship and sent from the ship as it proceeded through the Pacific. It was quite a valuable ship. And it was crewed by 83 men. There were 6 officers, 75 enlisted men. There were 2 civilian oceanographers, and the oceanographers were part of the Pueblo's cover story. They were there to make the claim that the Pueblo was actually doing peaceful oceanographic research on its missions. But it was a clearly marked Navy vessel. The captain was a gentleman by the name of Lloyd Bucher. His nickname was Pete. He was 40 years old. He was a career Navy officer. He had grown up as an orphan. He spent several years at Boys Town in Nebraska. At the very end of World War II, he had enlisted in the Navy, served there for a couple of years, had gone to the University of Nebraska, got himself a degree, went back into the Navy as an officer, and served in submarines in the 50s and early 60s. He served in 3 different submarines that patrolled in the Western Pacific. And he loved submarines. He loved the camaraderie of submarines. He loved the challenge of navigating over big expanses of ocean. He hoped one day to command his own sub, but he didn't make the cut, and the Navy gave him a surface vessel to command, which turned out to be the USS Pueblo, which he joined in 1966. He was married. He had 2 sons. His wife was a wonderful woman, unfortunately passed away about a year ago. A friend of his, a close friend of his, once described him to me as an intellectual barbarian, which was the best description of this guy I've ever heard. The intellectual part was he was a very intelligent man. He was very well read. He kept a set of Shakespeare's complete works in his stateroom. He could talk to you knowledgeably about literally any topic under the sun, anything from the San Diego Chargers to U.S. naval tactics off the coast of Vietnam. The barbarian part of it was that he loved to mix it up in bar brawls. He loved getting in fights with people. And the other thing he kept in his stateroom was his collection of Playboy magazines. And he was a character. He loved life. He loved to drink, he loved women, he loved to sing. He would tell me that he'd go into some wharfside dive somewhere and jump on the table and start singing at the top of his lungs, and everybody would gather around him. And he said, the thing about me, Jack, is that I know the lyrics to every song that's ever been written. So he was quite a guy. On the other hand, he was a very serious commander. He knew the ship backwards and forwards. The men really respected him for his skills and his knowledge. He was a terrific navigator. He was a very good ship handler. Earl can talk more about Captain Bucher. And he was the sort of guy that really made other men deeply respect him, and in some cases love him, actually. And the rest of the crew, there were another group of crewmen who were called communication technicians. There were 30 of these guys. And they were highly trained in operating all the eavesdropping gear. And there were a couple of Ivy Leaguers in that group. There was a young guy who was a Princeton dropout, and he was a trained Russian linguist. There were 2 Marine sergeants aboard the ship who were Korean linguists, although their skills were pretty rusty at the time the ship was captured. Most of the men were, ordinary seamen. They were very young. They were in their 20s. I'd say the average age was maybe 24, 25. About half of them had never been to sea before. So the ship was outfitted in Bremerton, Washington in the mid-60s. It sailed down our beautiful California coastline to San Diego. It underwent sea trials there for several weeks. And then proceeded across the Pacific to Japan. It was home-ported in Yokosuka. On January 5th, 1968, the ship departed Japan on its first and what turned out to be its only mission off the coast of North Korea. Its specific mission was to try and pinpoint North Korean radar and radio stations along the east coast of North Korea, which is a very rugged, very mountainous area. And the game plan was for the Pueblo to transit the Sea of Japan and then move north up the coast of North Korea to the point where it hits the Soviet border, turn south, and just eavesdrop on whatever it could on the way down the coast. Now, keep in mind, this is January. It's the dead of winter. There's not a lot of naval activity off North Korea, and the ship wasn't picking up very many signals as it proceeded down the coast. Bucher had been told repeatedly that the mission was low risk. He had really nothing to fear. The ship had no protection. There were no Navy destroyers over the horizon. There were no U.S. jet fighters circling somewhere nearby to bail him out if he got in trouble. And he also was not given very much equipment to destroy all the classified materials he had on the ship. There were all kinds of, the code machines, all the eavesdropping equipment was encased in metal. It turned out to be very durable, and all the crew had to try and destroy it, if it came to that, was basically sledgehammers, fire axes. There were a couple of shredders, very, very slow shredders that could only cut up a few pages at a time as you hand-fed them into the machines. And there were thousands and thousands of pages of classified documents, the military being the military. There were duplicates and triplicates and quadruplicates of everything on board. I mean, it was literally stacked in the passageways and some of the storage closets on the ship. There was so much of that stuff. So mission not particularly fruitful until he gets to the port of Wonsan, which was a very heavily militarized area in North Korea. It was a North Korean Navy base. There were about 75 MiG fighters stationed there in 1968. It had been a major target for United Nations forces during the Korean War in the early 50s. And he started to pick up some interesting signals at that point, and all the CTs get down to work, the communication technicians get down to work, and everybody kind of perked up. Oh, we got some good stuff here. Just before he got to Wonsan, something happened which Booker should have been informed about, but was not. And what happened was that the North Koreans sent a team of 31 highly trained commandos into South Korea, and their orders were to invade the South Korean presidential residence, which is known as the Blue House, to locate the president, a gentleman by the name of Park Chung-hee, to kill him, specifically to decapitate him, to murder his entire family, to murder his security detail, and then to steal trucks from the motor pool and try and escape back to North Korea. And so on the night of January 21st, 1968, which was a Sunday, these 31 young North Korean commandos are literally marching down a street in downtown Seoul. They're disguised as South Korean soldiers, and they get to within a half mile of the Blue House. They're armed to the teeth with submachine guns, with handguns. All of them have been, they're experts in judo and karate. If they lose all their weapons or their weapons jam, they can fight it out hand to hand. They're a half mile from the Blue House when they're finally challenged by a South Korean cop. An ordinary city cop says, "Where'd you guys say you were again? Where are you coming from?" And this is 10 p.m. on a Sunday night. "Where are you coming from?" And all hell broke loose. Shooting broke out. The cop was gunned down. Grenades are thrown. People are killed on nearby transit buses. The Koreans scatter in all directions. The South Korean army turns out. United States soldiers turn out. The next day, a huge manhunt is mounted with thousands of Allied troops trying to find these 31 guys. Only one by one, the Allies hunt them down and kill them. Only 2 of them are believed to ever have made it back to safety in North Korea. This happens on a Sunday night at 10 p.m. It starts happening, and Booker arrives off the North Korean port of Wonsan on the morning of January 23rd. So less than 2 days later, he wanders into this situation where North and South Korea are toe-to-toe. They're ready for war. Militaries on both sides are on high alert. Everybody's terrified that war is going to break out, and Booker, unfortunately, and his men show up at that exact moment. Nobody has told them that this had happened. Nobody has warned them that, you might want to pull back maybe to 50 miles offshore. Maybe we should postpone your mission for a month or so and wait for things to cool down. So anyways, Booker and his men are sitting there off Wonsan. They're about 15 miles out. They're well into international waters. They're doing their job. And they're approached, the North Korean gunboats start coming out one by one. And before they know it, they're surrounded by a flotilla of North Korean gunboats. There are 4 torpedo boats. There are 2 submarine chasers. There are 2 MiG fighters overhead. And the North Koreans open fire on the Pueblo. And the sub-chasers have 57 millimeter cannon, deck cannon. The torpedo boats obviously have torpedoes and 50 caliber machine guns. The torpedo boats can travel up to 15 knots. Booker's top speed is 13 knots. Booker's armament is 2 50 caliber machine guns that have no protective armor for the gunners. They're under tarpaulins, which are frozen. The gunners would have to run across the deck and basically yank or somehow pry the tarpaulins off and thread in the ammo and start shooting. They've got a handful of small arms like 45 pistols and Thompson submachine guns. So the Pueblo finds itself under attack. Bucher is fleeing at his top speed, which is 13 knots, pretty sluggish. There's no way he's hoping that somehow he'll break free of the North Koreans. They'll just let him go. But they don't. They keep firing. One of his sailors, a 19-year-old seaman by the name of Dwayne Hodges, is hit by a cannon shell in his groin. The shell nearly severs his leg. He bleeds out on the deck. 10 other sailors are wounded, a couple of them pretty seriously. Bucher himself is wounded. He keeps running. The North Koreans keep shooting. It's clear, I mean, there's holes are opening up all over his ship from the cannon shells and the machine gun slugs. He finally decides that if he doesn't stop, the North Koreans are just going to cut him to pieces and kill as many of his crew as they're going to kill. So he stops the ship. He stops the ship. The North Koreans board it. It's the first time in more than 150 years that a U.S. Navy commander has surrendered without a fight, which was something the Navy High Command was very unhappy about. But Bucher did what he thought was best. He didn't think he could escape. He thought that if he tried to fight back, his men would be slaughtered. And I happen to agree with him on that point. The North Korean, the ship falls into the North Korean hands. Most of the classified equipment is still intact. The National Security Agency later does damage assessments after interviewing the men when they come home, and determines that the loss has been fairly horrendous. Most of the code machines have fallen into the hands of the enemy. A lot of classified paper has fallen into their hands as well. And the NSA described it as one of the worst intelligence debacles in modern U.S. history. So I'm going to, there are other, I'm going very fast over the story. There are a couple of other major chapters in it. One is the secret negotiations between the United States and the North Koreans to free the crew, which Bruce is going to talk about. His dad was the United States Army general who was the chief American negotiator with the North Koreans during that whole process, during the tail end of that process, and he was very instrumental in getting the crew finally released. The crew comes home to San Diego on Christmas Eve in 1968. There's a tumultuous welcome for them. Thousands of ordinary San Diegans pour out to Miramar Naval Air Station to greet them. People are screaming, they're cheering, they're crying, they're holding up welcome home signs. Less than a month later, the Navy convenes a court of inquiry to try and get to the bottom of what happened and figure out who's to blame, what went wrong, what lessons can be learned. And the upshot of that is that the 5 admirals of the court unanimously recommend court-martial for Bucher, but Bucher was not court-martialed because the Navy Secretary threw out the recommendation. So anyways, as I say, I'm just skimming the surface of the story. It's really a fascinating tale. And if you'd like to read more about it, I'm going to be selling copies of my books afterwards. It's $20 for hardback and $15 for a paperback, and I'd be happy to sign them for you too. So let me proceed to our other guests. Senior Chief Earl Phares, who's seated in the middle here, was a member of the crew. He was just a deck seaman at the time, Earl, if I remember correctly. He had enlisted in the Navy as a musician in 1966 and wound up in a North Korean prison 2 years later. An interesting evolution, to say the least. Bruce Woodward, seated to Earl's left, is the son of Major General Gilbert Woodward, who, as I mentioned, was the chief American negotiator at Panmunjom and was the guy who basically finally got the crew out of there. And Bruce has some slides he's going to show us and tell us a little bit about his dad. So let's proceed to Earl, and I just want to ask, I've got some questions for this guy. I've been emailing with him for years now, and I finally get to meet him face to face.
Well, when we first got captured, it was something totally unique, to say the least. When we got off the train going from Wonsan to Pyongyang, the picture showing us with our hands up, of course we were scared, but it was damn cold in Korea. Maybe some of the Marines in the audience, I know I met one that was in the Chosun Reservoir. It's damn cold in Korea, especially in January. But they took us from the train station to the place called the barn, and that's where the interrogation started. And it was quite challenging. The name, rank, and serial number is about all you get in boot camp. And they took me in, and of course, I did not know what our mission was. And that was the need to know for the basic part of the crew. That helped us out a lot. And when they took me in, what was your job? And I said, I chipped and painted the ship, and I steered it. And they didn't like my answer. You know, and what is your job? I said, I chipped and painted the ship. Well, they have 82 other guys telling them the same thing. And so once, of course, they have our service records, and they're going through all the top secret records, and they're going through our service records. By the time they got down to my record, well, yeah, this guy's a musician. He doesn't know anything. So after they beat me up 3 interrogations, they left me alone. Well, in the barn, of course, our food was very limited, of course. I was about 180 pounds, and in about 6 weeks, I went down to about 120 pounds. Small dinner plate of rice, like the plate you have for your little canopies and cookies, small dinner plate of turnips, a little bit of grease on it, and hot water, and that's all we had for 6 weeks. That was our diet. So after a while, they had us write to our senators and to our loved ones at home for help to get out of here. I wrote Senator George Murphy, who was our California senator at the time, with Maggart, who was my gunner for the Ford 50. He really had a weird situation. He was in the Army in Germany, Checkpoint Charlie, and he got out of the Army, had a bad marriage, got divorced, and joined the Navy. Well, he made a bad mistake. So we both wrote a letter to Senator Murphy. Basically, our first draft was, get us the hell out of here, and signed our name. Well, that wasn't good enough for the Koreans, and they basically dictated our letters, basically to admit and apologize and assure that this will never happen again. And then, of course, to our families, and being an only child, I didn't have to join the Navy, sole surviving son. But I needed money for college, so I joined for the GI Bill. Anyway, I wrote to my mom, and to discredit the letter to my mom, I put in, make sure you tell my brother Joe that I'm fine and well. Well, Joe is my Siamese cat. So that discredited somewhat the letter to my mom, telling her that I'm not going along with feeling well and they're treating me fine. Of course, Booker, in his confession to the Korean government, he put in something like, penetration, however so slight, is enough to complete the act. You sailors and Marines all got that, which is good. And so that's about the only way we could confuse the Koreans and make the United States and the Navy know that we're doing our best to keep our honor going, and we're not going along with this program. We didn't want to be captured to begin with. So that's what we did for most of the time when they wanted us to do things and make confessions and to stay out of trouble with the government. And let me tell you, with all the movies that are out about John Wayne and anybody that makes a military movie, if you get captured, you're gonna break. I know that one movie about the guy that was the runner, the Italian guy. He did a great job. He never broke. My hat's off to him. But most cases, you're going to break. It's just a matter of time, especially in Korea. Of course, the Japanese are really horrible. But anyway, after we signed the confession, Booker saw what they did to spies. They showed him a South Korean spy, his eyes bulging out, his arm is broken. He decided that he didn't want any of his crew to suffer anymore, because they told him they're going to start with the lowest man on the totem pole and kill him if you don't sign, and that being the 19-year-olds, and I was one of them. So to find that out years later, that's great news for me. So we all signed under orders from Commander Booker to sign the confession that we were spies and that we did all these things that they said we did. After that, yes, ma'am.
Did they torture you?
Oh, yes, ma'am. They tortured everyone. to a different degree.
In what way? Mental?
Kicks, hits,
Physical?
well, mental was all the time, from the day one till the day we got out. But after they found out that I was just a bosun's mate, basically, and didn't know the ship's mission, they left me alone except when I get into the next stage of our captivity. So once they found out, they got their confession, they moved us to the farm, which was like a reserve training camp. It was a building. Koreans lived on the bottom deck. We took the second and third deck. Basic day would be, we'd get up about 5 o'clock in the morning, go out and do exercise for about 30 minutes, come back in, one deck would clean, one deck would eat breakfast, then we'd flip-flop, and then we'd sit in our rooms all day doing nothing, basically reading their propaganda. At noon, we'd have the noon meal, then we'd go out and play sports, be it football, basketball, volleyball, go back in and just sit and hold the magazine in front of your face and basically go to sleep. Because if you're sleeping, you're not in North Korea. And I had the senior oceanographer in my room at the farm, and we'd just go through things, the capitals, just stuff to keep your mind active. And after the evening meal, then we could take off our top coat, sit and play cards, play chess, and talk. During the day, you could not talk, because if you talked, the guards would come in and belt you one, give you the finger. Of course, we gave them the finger too, the Hawaiian good luck sign. And then lights out at 10 o'clock, and then it's just same thing over and over. Once a week, we'd go into a room with our room daddy, we call him, he was a junior officer, and be interrogated about the movie we had the Saturday night before, and it was all a political movie. One time we saw a movie, a guy was a musician, and he went in the army, got back out. And of course, me being a musician, they hit me up. What do you think of this guy? I said, great musician. He goes down with Beethoven, Bach, and Schroeder. Well, I got a few laughs on that. Well, my buddies, you know, we're trying to be sincere, and my guys are rolling on the floor, and the Koreans didn't pick up on it, so it didn't matter to me. I was just having fun with them. But just little things like that. And so during the whole time, we're hoping for repatriation, their word, just going home. Are they going to send us home at Easter to appease the Christian world? Are we going to go home on Independence Day, 4th of July? Are we going to go home on Thanksgiving? Are we going to go home at Christmas? Well, that turned out. What if we don't go home on the 23rd of January, 1969? I don't know how the guys did in Vietnam, 5-6 years in captivity. I don't know how I would have taken it. But we survived, and the senior oceanographer said, we're going to get out of here. After 2 weeks, we were hoping that they'd make a parking lot out of a place with a nice mushroom-shaped cloud. But after that, it's a little too late for that. You know, we just have to wait this out. And the oceanographer told me, he said, just hang tough. We'll be out of here. It's just going to take time for this gentleman's dad to get us out of here. So we made it, and I'll just wrap it up a little bit. It was good to be a POW. I say that in jest because, fortunately, besides being disabled, I got to read. I'm back to being a musician. I got to retire young, and life was good.
And in addition to those items, he's been married for 48 years.
I got married on D-Day, June 6th.
3 children, Earl? And
3 children, 3 grandchildren. My one son's in the Army. He completed 2 tours of duty in Kuwait, staff sergeant.
let me ask you about my favorite Pueblo story, which is the Hawaiian good luck symbol. Can you just, for the benefit of the folks who haven't heard about that, just explain what that was?
Well, to discredit the Koreans, that one challenge coin over there shows our senior, he's not a senior chief, but our most senior chief aboard the ship. It was on Life magazine. His room was at a picture-taking event, and to discredit their photo, they gave what we told them was the Hawaiian good luck sign, which was the middle finger. And we did that to every one of our photos that was ever taken, or mostly all the photos that were taken in captivity. And sometime during the summer, I guess it was, there were some Soviet bloc countries that came in to see how we were being treated. And they saw the photos and they said, well, don't you know what that means? And the Koreans said, well, yeah, that's the Hawaiian good luck sign. And they said, no, it's not. And then they looked through all their photos, and that's when the beatings really started towards the end of our stay at the North Korean Hilton. And they really know how to beat you up. And the poor gentleman that went to University of Virginia that went over and stole the sign and got 15 years and then came home dead. And the North Koreans said we didn't beat him up. Well, they know how to beat him up and don't leave any marks. Those Koreans, our quartermaster got beat up with a 2x4 across his back. He came home basically legally blind, but the Navy let him stay in, and he ended up being a SEER instructor down in San Diego for the SEER school, which is basically POW training. So he could finish out and get a retirement. So Chief Goldman and Charlie Law, Ron Behrens, who was a bosun's mate who steered the ship, was ordered by the Koreans to steer the ship into Wonsan. He got beat for 24 hours straight at the end, thrown in a room, gave a little bowl of gruel to eat, and then taken out and beaten more, severely beaten. I mean, I wasn't beaten half as bad as those guys. I mean, basically, my beatings were nothing compared to those guys, fortunately. I mean, when you had to stand there and just take it, and you can't fight back, or if you did, you get beaten worse. I had a few fights in high school, but I got to fight back. And something like that, it's just, and at the end, you'd see Chief Goldman walk by your room, you didn't even recognize him. They're savages.
The commandant of the prison camp was a guy that the Americans nicknamed Super C. He was a colonel when they were first taken there and later was promoted to general, but his nickname was Super C. And he was a pretty interesting guy. He was responsible, he was thought to be responsible for torturing and killing 200 American POWs during the Korean War. This is before you guys even showed up. Do you remember much about him? Can you describe him at all?
Well, I found out, like you say, he was very infamous during the Korean War. Like I said, I don't know how many people he killed, but he was pretty arrogant. And I know when we came back, when we first thought we were coming home, we had to see this war museum at Quezon, which was a joke. He had to make general, and then we were going home. Well, after seeing that museum, we got back on the train, and the sun was setting on the left, and the train was going north. And I thought, oh my God, we're going back. And he was waiting for us on the steps of the compound, and he was not one happy person. And that's when the beatings really started. I know one time, our room daddy, he had asked us, we always had to go through an interpreter. They all spoke English very well, but we always had to go through an interpreter. And our interpreter asked us, have you ever thought about writing home again? This is after the first batch of letters, like in March. This is like in July. And we all stood up in our room and said, no, we never thought about writing home. First of all, you didn't want to write home because that was a real chore. Everything had to be perfect. And then in the middle of the night, you had to record these letters, and that had to be perfect. And that intruded on our sleep. So we said, no, we never thought about writing home. Well, we had a big meeting the next Saturday with the colonel. Our room daddies are over there. And through his interpreter, he says, started with our room. Of course, Earl Keisler's face was pulverized with a little rubber slipper, looked like hamburger. We all saw that. He said, will you ride home? Damn straight. Every one of us stood up. Yeah, we'll ride home. And you could see our room daddy look at us like, you son of a bitch. You told me you wouldn't ride home. And we look back and he says, no, we said we never thought about riding home. Whatever the colonel said, and of course he always said, you guys can't just sit here all the time. You guys have to go to work. I don't want to go to work. I don't want to go in a coal mine. I'll milk a cow. I'll drive a truck. I'll do something, but I won't go in a coal mine. That's all I could envision. A 19-year-old's fantasies just went wild. We'd just say, we're lazy Americans. We'll just sit here until we go home. So he was a real, and like I said, we didn't know he was that vicious of a person until we got back and heard from Naval Intelligence about this guy.
Captain Bucher was, he suffered a great deal in prison. There was tremendous pressure put on him right from the get-go to sign his phony confession. You mentioned some of the being taken into the dungeon and exposed to the South Korean man who had been tortured. Another episode was they brought Bucher into a cell and made him get on his knees, and somebody stuck a gun into his ear and said, you either sign the confession, you son of a bitch, or we're going to count down from 2 minutes, and if you don't sign it, we're going to blow your damn brains out right here. And so Bucher's on his knees, he's shivering, he's shaking, he's terrified, he doesn't know what's going to happen. And that was one of a number of tortures, physical and mental, that he was subjected to just in the first few days that he was there. Can you talk a little bit about Bucher and the kind of leadership he provided to the men during their prison days?
Well, during the prison time, we didn't have much contact with Commander Bucher. The officers had officers' privileges. They had their own separate room, and we weren't supposed to talk with them. Most of the guys were in 8-man rooms, and the only time I really got to talk to Commander Bucher was during one of the football games, and the Koreans saw me talking to Commander Bucher, and they wanted to know what I was talking to him about, because I had been approached to go to another country to help speed the process along to get us out of there, and I thought they probably thought they were going to send me to Cuba, which that would have been a good thing. I'm a pretty good swimmer. I could have swam 90 miles and got home sooner. But I told Commander Bucher, I said, I think they're going to send me to another country, and I don't want to go. I don't want to be separated. And so they had taken Commander Bucher in to find out what he was talking to me about. And Commander Bucher, being a football player at Boys Town in college, he told him a football play. Well, at dinner one night, Chief Kell had passed a note to me, which you weren't supposed to do, and it was a football play, and I had to memorize it. And then next evening or day, they took me in, and what were you talking to Commander Bucher about? And I said, well, it was a football play. And of course I ate the note, spy business. I can't put it down the toilet. I can't put it in our bucket. They're going to retrieve it. And so they bought that. But all in all, when I first met Commander Bucher aboard the ship in Japan, it was like, our ship is like the Mr. Roberts, the movie, which is my favorite movie. I thought, oh, this is going to be one fun cruise. But, he was a sailor, hard drinking and fun loving, but he knew his business as far as I could see. Like I said, I only had really about 23 days with him at sea. But he kept everybody pretty much in line. We had our senior enlisted men in the room that basically kept us in line. Whatever our senior man said, that went. And like I said, kind of had a chain of command in the camp, but Commander Bucher really didn't have much to say. He had one of his shipmates that would come in and clean his room and kind of get messages out. but nothing significant to the crew. So it was mainly our room leader, leading petty officer, that kept us going, and we knew Commander Bucher was in charge overall, and we would do whatever came down the pipeline. If he said something, we'd do it. But as far as I'm concerned, he's a great officer. Little tweaky, but I liked him, and I think most of the crew likes him. I know there's one person that doesn't like him, but I'm not going to say who that is.
Well, I'm getting that high sign that we need to move on to Bruce's presentation. He's got some slides for us, so take it away, Bruce.
What a great show. Thanks for having us. My name is Bruce Woodward, the very proud son of Lieutenant General Gilbert H. Woodward, the negotiator of the release of the crew of the USS Pueblo, and Earl is one of those 82 guys. My dad was very fond of reminding the Navy guys that it took the Army to rescue the Navy ship. So he had a lot of fun with that, but it was a team effort. And you remember at the time, 1968, there was another war going on in Vietnam. We couldn't afford to have another theater in North Korea, which today, if they did something like that, they'd probably be wiped off the map. But there was a lot going on. Anyway, my dad was a West Point class of 1941 and had been in diplomatic military circles in Berlin and Paris, and was kind of brought into Panmunjom, where the negotiations took place. And he was a tough guy. He was smart and tough. He was a tanker. And he was kind of cherry-picked to say, well, we got a lot going on. We're not getting anywhere with the Pueblo negotiations. His counterpart in Panmunjom was a guy named General Pak, who was, a real puppet for the commies. And in these negotiations, which I'm going to show you a few little slides over here on the screen just to kind of put a little color in things. This is just one of several photos at Panmunjom on the United Nations command on our side and the North Koreans on the other, where all of this would be done. And it's a demilitarized zone, so you'd have a lot of press and people looking in the windows. It was intense negotiation because the North Koreans would just go around and make up things, and there was a lot of games being played, but one of my dad's favorites was, they called him an imperialist Wall Street lackey. We loved that. There was a lot of gamesmanship. Remember, you had to translate from English to Korean to Chinese, so it's just hours of sitting there listening, and the North Koreans would smoke cigars and cigarettes, which they purposely blew into on the American side, and the Americans rigged up some fans up here to blow the smoke back. So there was a lot of dead time to get this work done. Sometimes the North Koreans wouldn't show. And my dad, the United Nations command, had to figure out, now what are we going to do? But at the end of the day, there were three demands. The North Koreans wanted to give up the ship and return the men. A U.S. admission that we had violated the North Korean waters, an apology for that, and that it would never happen again. Those are the three things. After a bunch of small false starts, it took the wife of a State Department official who was privy to these negotiations to say, well, why don't you just sign the document and tell them what they want and then repudiate it after that? So that's what we did, leave it to the wife. So it was called an overrider receipt. Yes, we're going to sign the document, and then right after we sign it, we're going to repudiate it, just to get the crew back, and only for that reason. President Johnson at the time said, well, I'll go along with this nutty idea, as he called it, if my dad would sign it. And then, by the way, this is an interesting slide, the propaganda piece, and any of this stuff is available if anybody's interested, sort of what they would say on their side of the critique of all the awful things the Americans were doing. And then finally, on December 17th, my dad was instructed to tell General Pak to give him an ultimatum, that if you don't accept the override proposal, by December 23rd, in order for the crew to be back by Christmas, We're going to withdraw the offer, no more negotiating, and the North Koreans can take their chances with the incoming Republicans in the Nixon administration. So that was enough to put the heat on them. And this photo here is the actual signing. And remember, the North Koreans had no credibility. This is their document. This is the Korean version in the American document that we signed, saying we're so sorry we were in your space, and the document. But on December 23rd, my dad signed this document right here, pushed it across the table with the North Koreans milking it for the propaganda value, and across the bridge of no return, Commander Booker, Earl, all the other prisoners were not sure what was going on, but their nightmare was about to be over, and we got the release of the crew. And there's Commander Booker doing some talking right after it happened, and the one corpse. We have a military photograph. But that's the story, and I think what a great presentation. My personal belief is the Pueblo story should be a feature-length movie. It's a forgotten footnote in military history, and it's so important, especially with the North Koreans today, and I hope we see that one day. So, thanks for coming.
Well, we were supposed to go across the bridge about 10 o'clock, and something hit the fan. I guess it was the repudiation thing. And we were sitting on the bus for about another half hour, 45 minutes. Got kind of nervous because we got that close. I mean, we got close when we had the museum, and then we were supposed to go down, and then something hit the fan. And we got that close, and then we almost weren't going home. And I wonder what would have happened if they would have waited till Nixon got elected. That would have been interesting. But it was, I think in that photo he showed, I think that was me just on the edge of the photo, because the gentleman in front was one of the tallest guys aboard the ship, and I know I was walking behind him and closing the gap pretty close, because we were told to stay about 15 meters in back of the guy, or you'd be shot. And you could see the MPs with their big POW caps with the letters MP, and we knew M16s were pointed this way, and we knew AK-47s were pointed that way. And one James Bond movie, Die Another Day, if you've seen that movie, I kind of like that scene where he's passing, and all of a sudden they retreat to their trucks. And I remember the feeling very well. And my legs were kind of stiff, and I've got nerve damage in my legs from neuropathy, and of course cold weather, and a size 9 stuffed in a size 6 shoe. I had to actually shuffle across the bridge, and it was a long wait. And I got to the other side, and Commander Booker said, I said, Phares, Earl, RB 82, 83, 79. They said, good enough for me. You can relax. I said, no, I think I'll keep on going towards those buses and get a GI jacket on and get out of harm's way a little better. But that bridge is closed now. It's all overgrown with trees and stuff, and they don't even use it. Even the guy that, the latest North Korean that escaped, didn't go across that bridge to safety, the one that got shot at just recently.
A couple of people have asked this question: why didn't the Pueblo have adequate air and surface cover from other assets? Let me take a stab at that. You have to keep in mind when this happened, January 1968, the height of the Vietnam War. A lot of the aircraft in the Far East were at that point assigned to the Vietnam War. The other thing that was going on at the time was that the Air Force was switching over to Phantom jets, and they were just being introduced to some of the air squadrons in Japan, and people didn't know how to fly them yet, so they were kind of hobbled a little bit by that. The other thing was, the other key thing, and probably the overriding factor, was that everybody in the Navy thought this was going to be a cakewalk. The mission was rated low risk. The attitude was that the worst that's going to happen to the Pueblo is the North Koreans going to send out a couple of gunboats. They're going to harass you. They're going to try to scare you back from the coast so that your surveillance equipment won't work as well at a greater distance. And that turned out to be a very, very wrong assumption. The Pueblo, the only real protection, and I use that word very loosely, was there there was a contingency plan that if the Pueblo got in trouble, the Air Force would send planes over from Japan. But it turns out no planes were available in Japan at that time. And there was an Air Force general named Seth McKee who really made it his business to try and help the Pueblo. And he had a checklist of things he was trying to do. One of the things he did was call up the USS Enterprise, which was sailing south through the Sea of Japan on its way back to South Vietnam to Yankee Station. And he actually tried to get operational command of the carrier so that he could order its planes into the air. And the Navy said, no, we're not going to give the USS Enterprise to an Air Force general. So what he wound up doing was calling up a squadron of F-105 fighter bombers on Okinawa, which was far from where the Pueblo was. It was 1,100 miles away. But he gave orders to the squadron there to take off as soon as possible to get in the air, to refuel in South Korea because it was so far, and then to attack the North Korean gunboats that were trying to steal the Pueblo. And there was a squadron leader named John Wright. He was a major from Texas. And they scrambled those planes, and they were in the air within about an hour and a half after that order came through. And unfortunately, there wasn't nearly enough time. It was by the time the American planes got to Osan Air Force Base in South Korea, it was nightfall, and they didn't have the proper night navigation equipment. They didn't even have air-to-air guns on those jets. So the Pueblo by then was in the port of Wonsan, and the crew had been removed from the ship anyways. So the orders changed, and John Wright's squadron was then told to go up to Wonsan the next day and sink the ship, to attack the ship and sink the ship. And they didn't even know if the crew was still aboard or not. It turned out the crew was long gone, but they didn't know that. And Wright's pilots got in their cockpits, and he gave them a briefing, and it was a 25-minute air flight up there, and they took off some of their gas tanks so they could load extra bombs, and they were going to dive bomb the Pueblo in Wonsan Harbor. That was the game plan, and it was a suicide mission. I mean, there was anti-aircraft batteries all over that area. There were 12 planes in Wright's squadron, and nobody thought they were going to get out of there alive. And they got into their cockpits the day after the capture, and they sat there. They sat there that day, they sat there the next day, they sat there the third day, and finally they were told to stand down because the United States, Lyndon Johnson, president at the time, had opted to try to get the crew back through the secret negotiations that Bruce's dad was involved in. The person wrote, "I think Commander Booker was treated unfairly. Do you agree?" You want to take that?
No doubt. I mean, he really wanted a court-martial so the ship would roll uphill. So all the admirals that said it was a low-risk mission, the Banner had been on these ops before, and they had been harassed by the Russians and the Chinese, and I think a little bit by the North Koreans before, and nothing had happened like this. So, low risk, okay, fine, low risk mission. Don't arm us. I mean, why put the 50s on there? That was my GQ station, was the loader for the Ford 50. If you're not going to make them operational, don't bother. They were just there for show. They were old 50s that the Marines wanted to get rid of. They worked, but for how long? I was on a cruiser, and their 50s jammed all the time too, and they were supposed to be up-to-date 50s. But that's why he wanted a court-martial. The admirals made mistakes. I personally haven't talked to, but I've heard secondhand, and we even talked to one admiral that was on the board of inquiry. He said, all this information, if I'd known that now, I wouldn't have been so hard on Booker. Well, hell, we tried to tell you that at the court of inquiry. Why didn't you listen? So, they just, all the admirals that are from Washington that sit in a desk, I don't know what their command experience was at the time, besides sitting behind a desk, wanted us to play John Paul Jones. It just didn't work out. And so that's why Bucher wanted ComNav 4 Japan to take a hit and then all the way up the chain of command. And I think they were afraid of that, and that's why they let it go.
Another question, did the Pueblo actually enter North Korean territorial waters? That was the pretext for the capture. The North Koreans insist to this day that the ship intruded in their territorial waters. At the time, most communist countries defined their territorial waters as 12 miles out from shore. We defined our territorial waters as only 3 miles out from shore in that year. So Bucher's orders were to approach no closer than 13 miles, and he told his navigators that if they got within 14 miles, to call him to the bridge. And they actually took a chart, a marine chart, and crosshatched it in red to show where the 13 and the 14-mile mark was. And the navigators were told, don't on your life cross that line. And I interviewed Bucher extensively, and I asked him a lot about this question, and he said, no, we didn't violate their territorial waters. I interviewed one of the other navigators, Charlie Law, that Earl mentioned, who was a superb navigator. He was 26 years old. He was a quartermaster. He was the guy who was legally blinded as a result of malnutrition in prison. He had hoped to become a navigator on tuna boats in the San Diego area after he got out of the Navy. That wasn't possible, obviously. He also told me that no, at no time did we cross the 14-mile limit. The interesting thing to me is that it's moot. The question of territorial waters is completely moot. Under international law, if you're in a naval vessel and you actually do violate somebody's territorial waters, the offended party only has the legal right to escort your ship back out to the open sea, into international waters. They do not have the right under international law to open fire on you, to attack you, and to capture and torture your crew for a year. So, this question is still asked today. Did they violate the territory? It doesn't make any difference. The North Koreans violated international law in attacking a military vessel that was anywhere near their coast.
Their claim was that we did violate their waters, but they wanted to say we were 14 miles. Well, they used the island of Yodo as their legal boundary. So yeah, we were really close to Yodo, but that wasn't the coastline. So it's like using Catalina as their boundary. So yeah, we were close to Catalina, but we weren't close to the mainland. So if you want to use that scenario. But no, I was always told 13.3, and something like you said, 14. And like you said, Charlie Law was a great navigator. Our officer who was a navigator, I think, was inept. But he didn't. I don't think he had to charge him much.
I have one comment, and I don't know if it's true, but somebody told me that the Pueblo ship, which had been parked in Pyongyang in the water, had been moved in concrete into the city, and I don't know if that's true. Do you know?
Yeah, well, they moved it during the Clinton administration. They moved it from Wonsan with a Polish crew around South Korea into Pyongyang, where it sat at a port for a while, at a berth for a while, and then just lately they moved it up to their new war museum in what I suspect is a cofferdam. I don't know if it's actually in concrete, but one of the latest spy satellite photos shows it listing about 10 degrees to port. So I don't know if it's rusting out at the bottom or not, but it's not in pretty good shape.
Well, let me ask the audience. You folks have any questions you want to shout out? Go ahead, sir.
What happened to Booker?
He died. No. He ended up, well, he made commander, and he didn't go any farther, but then he ended up working for Mine Flotilla 1 out of Guam, and then he retired, ended up becoming a painter out of Poway, and had some great artwork. I forget what year he did pass away. He's buried at Rosecrans, and his wife died a few years ago. She's buried with him. and we miss him greatly. My son bicycles up there once in a while and lays a wreath around there, and of course I go up there and lay a dime down, or I think it's a penny or a nickel. It's a tradition.
Could the ship have been scuttled once it was found out they couldn't escape the towboat?
The engineering officer said, sure, we could have scuttled it, but the water was so shallow that they could have raised the ship, the equipment, the publications, and 83 bodies. So it wouldn't have been worth scuttling.
Did any more senior officers ever get any blame for this, any official blame?
That's a really good question.
I think you can answer that better than I can.
Well, the court of inquiry, the conclusion was there are 5 admirals that sat on the court of inquiry, and they were in a courtroom in Coronado, opposite San Diego. And the hearing went on for several weeks, and part of it was public, part of it was classified. And the admirals voted unanimously at the end to recommend a court-martial for Bucher. And there were 5 charges against him. Probably the central charge was that he gave up the ship when he had the power to resist, which is a violation of long-standing naval regulation. So the case, the media covered the case extensively. There were newspapers, magazines, radio, TV. It was on network news a lot. And the public really, as the story came out of the suffering that the crew had undergone in prison, how few weapons they had to work with when the North Koreans attacked them, how everybody assumed that nothing would happen anyways. When the public heard the whole story, there was kind of an outpouring of sympathy for Bucher and his men. And that was shared by the press. I mean, the press really liked Bucher because he was, he'd come up from enlisted ranks, he was a Mustang, and he was standing up to naval authority, and he was trying to tell the story. And this is also at the height of the Vietnam War, when literally hundreds of American soldiers were coming home every month in body bags. And the public was turning against the war. And a lot of people saw Bucher as this kind of anti-establishment hero, because he made a decision at great cost to himself and his career to save the lives of his men. I mean, he could have slugged it out with the North Koreans with their 50 calibers and their Thompsons, but a lot of his guys would have been killed in the process. I'm fairly certain. So there was a great deal of sympathy. I'm getting the high sign that we got to wrap it up here. Anyways, the recommendation for a court-martial went up the Navy chain of command, and the guys running the Navy at the time basically realized, we can't court-martial this guy. The public just won't stand for it. So the recommendation was overruled by the Navy Secretary at the time, John Chaffee, with the famous comment that these men have suffered enough, and there'll be no future naval action. To answer your specific question, was any higher up held to account? In the original court-martial recommendations, there were recommendations for discipline against several higher-ranking officers, including an admiral who was the operational commander of the Pueblo in Japan, and it was alleged that he hadn't ensured that the ship was properly equipped for its voyage. But all those recommendations were thrown out too by John Chaffee.
I think all in all, the main thing is we did not have the means to resist. If we did, it would have been a totally different chapter in history.
So anyways, I think we've pretty much run out of time. Thank you so much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about this.